Good afternoon, everyone. While you're getting settled, I just have a few general remarks. So I'm Ruth Huffbauer, the director of the GDPE program. I want to welcome you all to the Distinguished Ecologist Seminar Series. So this year, as you know, we are focusing on climate change, emerging issues across scales, and this is our third talk in this academic year seminar series and our very first in-person visiting ecologist, which I'm really so thrilled about. Hooray for that. So last year, everything was remote, so I realized when I got a question from a student of mine today that folks around here don't necessarily currently know what the culture of the seminar series has been. So we invite folks from outside the university who typically come in the spring, and we only have 3, sometimes 4 of them, and we always ask them to give 2 talks each. So last year during the pandemic, doing all of that remotely, we didn't want to burden them with 2 different talks. So I just want to remind you there's another one, so come back tomorrow. Let's see, what else did I want to say? Okay, so before Danny, or Dr. Hunter now, introduces Dr. Grover, I want to remind you that the call is open for the next academic year's seminar series. So really think about who you can bring. Our theme is really broad next year. XCOM chose Frontiers of Ecology Addressing Challenges of the 21st Century. So many amazing scientists work on addressing the challenges we're facing, and Danny is an amazing example of the fact that students can host speakers as well. It doesn't have to be just faculty, but you can ask faculty members or other students to back you up and help you with that. And so think about who you might like to invite, and I'll send out a reminder over email about that. And that's it. That's all I have on my notes. And so with that, I will let Danny introduce our visiting distinguished ecologist.
Hey everyone, thank you for being here. So Dr. Andrea Grover is our Rising Star Distinguished Ecologist. And since we haven't had distinguished ecologists here in person for a while, I'll explain what that means. So the Rising Star specifically is for early career researchers who are within 10 years of receiving their PhD. And so when I thought about Dr. Grover's accomplishments, I was already intimidated by the idea of having to be her co-host. And then when she sent me her CV the other day, and I remembered that she did in fact receive her PhD within the last 10 years, I was even more impressed and even more intimidated by her accomplishments. And so we're so pleased to have her. Dr. Grover is an associate professor of information science and technology at the University of Nebraska in Omaha, and she conducts cutting-edge research at the intersection of science, technology, and public engagement. She has a really impressive publication history with several publications that have over hundreds of citations, and a couple that even have over 1,000 citations. She's taught several courses at both the graduate and undergraduate level. She's currently an associate editor for Frontiers in Ecology and the Environment, and has previously served as an associate editor for Citizen Science Theory and Practice, and was the editor-at-large for Citizen Science Today. Before going to the University of Nebraska, Omaha, she was an assistant professor at the University of Maryland in College Park, and a Data One postdoc fellow at the University of Nebraska and Cornell, in the Cornell Lab of Ornithology. She received her PhD from Syracuse University in Information Science and Technology in 2012. And for her dissertation, she was awarded the All-University Doctoral Dissertation Prize. She also received a Master's of Science in Information from the University of Michigan in 2007, and has a Bachelor of Arts in Mathematics from Alma College in Michigan. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Andrea Grover, who will speak to us today about cultivating climate resilience in citizen science.
think that was the most thorough intro anyone has ever given, so thank you very much. Also, I'll let you know they don't require your transcripts for this, so if you didn't know it already, I've never taken an ecology course in my life. If I'd known when I was younger what was in that space, I totally would have, but then I wouldn't be here, right? And I'd be doing something completely different. So the last time I gave a talk in person was February 28th of 2020 at the United Nations Statistical Commission. So I think this is a great re-entry into giving in-person talks, and it is, I joke not, just as intimidating. So forgive me if I'm a little bit rustier, a little less smooth on this. It's been a little while. But as the intro claimed, I picked a topic that I felt would work with the theme because a lot of citizen science works in a lot of different spaces, and in climate change, there's about 1 million projects probably that, okay, that's an exaggeration, thousands of projects that work on climate change related themes, and I was like, well, I could cherry pick some stuff, or we could talk about where it could go. And so that's kind of what I decided to do. This is a lovely interdisciplinary setting, and so the kind of perspective I'm bringing is much more of a social ecological perspective. In my primary spaces, we talk about socio-technical stuff, and so kind of it's really all of those things, right? And so we're all connected in a wide variety of ways, and ever more obviously so to the environment, and the environmental health and community health really interact and relate to one another. And as a result, people are worried about what is going on around the world. And we're pretty much all worried. The students that I get from rural Nebraska, from very conservative communities, are just as worried as everyone else, right? They're seeing the changes too. And in the face of all of this, science is really one of the things that gives me hope. So I think back to the dissertation research many years ago, where I was talking to Gretchen LeBun, who was working with the Great Sunflower Project in the early days of that project, and she said, you know, she repeatedly hears this thing about people being really depressed and really worried about what's going on in the environment around them, and being able to be involved in citizen science gives them a sense of empowerment and a way to make a difference for things that they care about. And that alone has enormous value. What we've also learned about the differences in pollinator populations in rural, suburban, and urban environments also matters. But for people to feel like what they're doing really makes a difference helps us all keep the hope up and keep the energy moving things forward. So rather than an agenda, I like to frame what I want to talk about in terms of questions that I hope I can answer. And if I don't quite answer them, please feel free to bring them up again at the end. So I pretty much always start with some definitions to make sure we're on the same page. I have spent my entire academic career in interdisciplinary spaces, so I never assume that we're all talking about the same thing until we agree on it, right? And then a little bit about, like, I read up on climate resilience, climate resilient communities, and what that kind of looks like right now, because I felt like that was really worthwhile to spend my time on that, so that I could talk with you about how citizen science fits into that picture. So we'll go into that a little bit. And then by way of example, I pulled out something that's related to urban ecosystems. There are many other examples that we could work with, of course. And then just a couple of thoughts about what it would take to get there and to kind of deliver on the promise. Sound all right? Everybody on board? All right, you are better than my undergrads. So the key terms I want to make sure that we are all on board with. Climate resilience is generally defined as some kind of ability of systems to deal with and recover from disruptions. And typically that involves self-organization and adaptation. And I know those are loaded words too. Interestingly, those are things that I studied in my master's program under the heading complex systems theory. So it actually kind of all comes back around at some point. Community resilience, okay, we're getting into some buzzwords here, totally like acknowledged, right? But in terms of practical understanding, right, it's the sustainability of a community to withstand and recover from adversity. I want to amend that to say human communities. That's usually what we're talking about with this stuff. The other communities matter too. And then with community-driven climate science is the community capacity to actually figure out what do we want to do to combat climate change, what are our priorities, what makes us vulnerable, what do we have to bring to this game, and how do we make it move forward? And so much of the work there is really focused on those upfront steps in the planning and kind of what I'm interested in is how do we fold citizen science into that? Now, citizen science, community science, participatory science, I'm going to use these terms interchangeably. The meaning that I am referring to is collaborative research that involves the public in authentic scientific inquiry. It does not have to involve professionals. It just has to involve collaborative efforts that focus on real science. That means it can take a wide range of forms, can look like a lot of different things to different people. And most of my work is really on the top-down scientist-led forms of citizen science proper, right? So this is like stretching my little wings a little bit, but citizen science in general, community science, participatory science, they can all be more or less community-driven. I said the terminology is a little bit of a mess because different terms mean different things to different people, and we tried rebranding back in like 2009 with public participation in scientific research, but that really does not roll off the tongue. So citizen science has some street cred and some appeal to the imagination, so that's pretty widely adopted. Community science is getting a lot more traction as people are concerned about inclusiveness, and participatory science I see as a little bit more umbrella to all of those. Basically, when we were thinking about this way back when, every term that means a similar thing has already been claimed by another science and by some other practices. So there wasn't a lot of wiggle room to rebrand. But back to the topic at hand. So looking at resilient communities, what do they have in common? What kind of capacities do they have that make it possible for a community to be resilient in the face of climate change? Fascinatingly, all the vulnerable communities that they have looked at in some of these studies have common assets that they are leveraging in the face of climate events. The local solutions use the same kind of capacities but deploy them differently in the face of drought versus flood versus wildfire. So there's a lovely report that's actually distributed through USAID that looked at Indonesia, Ethiopia, and I'm blanking on the other two countries, right? But several developing countries and that experience wildly different climate effects. And they all kind of come down to similar capacities that they leverage. The other kind of qualifications on this are that most of these are indigenous, rural, pastoral, or agricultural, and poor communities. That's part of what makes them vulnerable to climate effects, right? Well, turns out a lot of the US is rural, pastoral, or agricultural, and not very well off. 88 counties in the state of Nebraska have an average income below the country median, right? It's 37 counties, I think, in Colorado. We have a lot of counties in Nebraska, and generally speaking, more cows than people in a lot of those places, right? So some of these principles actually apply right here, and some of them in very different ways because we bring other privilege and resources to these issues. But among all of those contexts, community health is one of the biggest assets that helps people bounce back in the face of adversity. And as I hope folks in this room are well aware, environmental health and public health, pretty well interwoven. You can't have one without the other, or at least not very effectively and not for very long. The other thing that was a major commonality, I think, for these developing contexts as well as here, is social capital. Those local networks of connections between people, both looser and tighter connections, that is some of the most important resources that people turn to when they're faced with a climate emergency. They go to their neighbors and all their kind of relations and the folks in their communities and seek help in those ways. So when we had catastrophic flooding in Nebraska a couple years back because of ice dams on the Missouri River, it was epic, right? And people were, everybody who had a horse trailer went out and helped people pull their livestock out. Even by a big city like Omaha, there's plenty of agricultural land where people were racing to help. The Humane Society was on 24/7 call, right? And so it was that extended community, all those connections that people have that they tapped into to help them get through that event. A lot of people housed other people for a long time while they were getting back on their feet because their housing was just wiped out. Right? And so we see that happening here all the time, but it's actually one of the most critical things that we need to cultivate to really help people get back on their feet and get back to helping the environment get back on its feet too. So if we really want to cultivate some climate resilient communities, we have to do it at the community level, right? The local context is really going to determine what resilience looks like. So resilience in Fort Collins is going to look different from resilience in Omaha, is going to look different from resilience in Tallahassee, Florida, right? They are different kinds of responses to different kinds of events that people are going to have to mount, and they are all going to tap into some of those shared resources, but in different ways. The communities actually have to drive climate resilience work. You can't just tell people, boom, you're resilient, right? We can't wave a wand. It doesn't happen magically, and it doesn't happen overnight, right? It takes some work, and it's not particularly sexy work. You can't buy it, but money sure does help. If we could throw some money at these problems, it would get us so much further, so much faster. But it's not just for sale. This is something we have to develop for ourselves. So all of the resources that I looked at, if there was one takeaway I got from all of it, community engagement isn't optional, it's required. You can't build community resilience without the community agreeing to be part of that adventure, right? So if we take this as a given and say we have to get community engagement to develop the resilience that we need to deal with the kind of climate impacts that we're seeing, well, great thing is we actually have tons of resources on how to get started with this. So some of the work that I found really focuses on planning and organizing in communities, how to make sure we're doing it equitably, that we're getting the right kind of representation, that we're addressing the right issues, that we're taking full advantage of the assets the community has to bring, because those local solutions are the ones that are actually going to work, and they have to adapt to the local context. So there's great how-to resources available. Please do not invent the wheel if this is something you are interested in. There is really, really good stuff out there that's been well vetted and basically agrees with all the social movements theory I've read. It agrees with everything I've ever seen about how organizations work and how communities work, which is great. Internal consistency, we like it. There's also substantial emphasis on deep public engagement. It's not just people showing up and consulting once for a couple of hours. It's people coming back, people being engaged in multiple ways. So interestingly, all of the things that they want this public engagement for to get to a kind of community climate resilience are all things that we have seen as direct results of participatory science. Public awareness, public participation in advocacy, participation in decision-making and prioritization of the things that we're actually going to undertake, figuring out how to make these things happen in ways that are respectful of the local needs and goals. And so, like, to me, this is kind of a no-brainer, right? And ecology has a long history with participatory science. So a few years back, some of us put together this very cleverly titled piece asserting, no holds barred, that citizen science will help with natural resource management and environmental protection, both of which are pretty critical for this kind of climate resilience goal. And ecological research is kind of obviously critical to the whole thing in the first place, right? We have to understand what's going on in the local environment if we're going to respond and adapt appropriately, and especially when it comes to environmental health and the way it impacts human communities. So that is absolutely on the radar 100% of the time, but it often gets buried in how do we work with the communities, because honestly, that part is harder. The science is almost the easy part. In all of this stuff, the social ecological systems are foregrounded. We can't take it for granted. It has to be a priority. So the great thing with participatory science is it really supports these virtuous cycles for both environmental science and resource management. You get people involved in helping, they advocate for more resources, they bring other people in, and they keep it going. And that is like kind of a real good deal if you have to get a community involved and keep things moving for some time to achieve those goals. Because like I said, it's not going to happen overnight. So basically, this is a perfect match. If we can get community-driven participatory science, then we're really moving in the right direction for some of the climate resilience work that also needs to happen. And the great news is, as a field, ecology knows how to do this. Right? We have so many excellent examples of good organizing work that have really been built over time. And it's not all community-driven, but there are some real good examples of work that is. And I could have dug deep and found lots of those to share with you, but honestly, I would love for people to discover for themselves, because there's so much like fantastic stuff to learn about in terms of what people are willing to support in the science and working to support their communities. So climate resilience really does need community science. And there's a couple of reasons that it needs to work this way, in my opinion, at least. And first of all, like, we can get data to support some of this community prioritization that's required to actually make progress on climate resilience. If we don't have data, then we're not making particularly good decisions, and that data could look like a lot of different things. But citizen science is one of the things it can look like. We also, if we're engaging the public in the science part of it, we're developing capacity for actually assessing those vulnerabilities and identifying the assets, which is another one of those critical steps in climate resilience planning. It's in all of the guidebooks that you need to do this assessment and figuring out your assets. Who better than the people who live in a community, right? They're gonna know, hands down, way more about what is available to build from. And with that, we also get some local knowledge of climate impacts and adaptive capacity. So if you wanna mitigate flood risks, you gotta ask the locals, because they know where it floods. They know where the storm sewers don't hold up under a heavy rainfall. And so that's an invaluable resource. We can't just GIS map that without adequate kind of context. We can also help demonstrate the impact of community-driven solutions. So when we get to the point where we're putting interventions in place, we've got a climate action plan, we've got community engagement and making things happen, we've put investments and money on the line, and we really wanna see, is it working? If we keep on some citizen science happening to do some assessment, to do some monitoring, to do some data collection, we have the opportunity to have people demonstrating that it's actually working. And if it's not, then we change our plans and we try another thing and we keep monitoring, right? And this is the kind of goal setting and outcomes achievement that is actually really gratifying for a lot of people. So in terms of the question of would people do it, I think they would, from what I have seen. Right? We can also, generally speaking, achieve much better solutions when we include diverse stakeholders. So this photo that I shamelessly stole from UNO's Service Learning Academy is from a P16 service learning project where a chemistry course at the undergraduate level worked with an AP chemistry class at the high school level, worked with the Henry Dorley Zoo and the Wildlife Safari Park to do macroinvertebrate monitoring in the safari park to figure out how they're doing and managing their water resources there and what kinds of changes they might need to make. And this is the kind of thing where you're bringing in a bunch of different perspectives and different ways of thinking that are likely to yield a different solution and different outcomes. And if nothing else, we got a bunch of kids out there doing macroinvert monitoring that probably would never have had that opportunity otherwise. And that could be a life-changing opportunity for them. You just never know how that part is gonna play out. So you gotta trust that some of it's gonna happen. All right, so I'm moving a little faster than I thought. I tend to talk fast, these things. I'm sorry if I'm going too fast. All right, so in urban ecosystems, and again, not my specialty, not actually a trained ecologist, although the ecologists forget that I'm not. So if we want to look at a sustainable, resilient urban ecosystem initiative, there's a couple of key ingredients that requires too. So we have to figure out the vulnerabilities, like I said before, and we also need triple bottom line assessment of ecosystem assets. What do we have working for us in our green spaces, our blue spaces, and our green infrastructure? And how are those kind of distributed throughout the urban environment? So somebody was telling me earlier today how all of the residences in Fort Collins are within a certain range of some kind of natural space, however small and however modest, even if it's stormwater retention, right? And that's exactly the kind of asset that people can monitor and map and that we can take into account. Some of the resources actually suggested using a formal asset management system so that this is being treated as importantly as our built environment, because it is at least that critical to achieving the kinds of community health outcomes that we want to see. So in this kind of case, the community-based monitoring just makes sense. If you are able to do equitable recruitment and involvement of people, then you can get a spread of volunteers across an urban landscape. Now, if you only allow for self-selection, you will absolutely have a biased sample. You will oversample all of the wealthy, educated neighborhoods, and you will undersample all of the quote-unquote blighted neighborhoods, the less advantaged neighborhoods, right? So you have to actually really work differently to make sure that it all gets the attention that it deserves. So ongoing monitoring really lets us do some proactive management and like prompt responses. And so if we can manage to do some of these ongoing monitoring projects in an urban environment in a meaningful way and keep it going, then we're much better set up for success and for responding appropriately when situations go awry. It also encourages a culture of stewardship, which I can't even tell you how many times in the first, 3 years of working in citizen science, I heard stewardship, we want stewardship, everybody should be into stewardship. They were also afraid to say climate change at the time, right? I was working a lot with the national parks and they were afraid of the kind of political take on that. And so stewardship was really that kind of the proxy for the community engagement and commitment to the local environment. That was the way it was kind of being framed. And it also lets people take meaningful action, like that quote that I had at the beginning. It lets them do something that lives their values and contributes to something that they really do care about, that they really are concerned with. So I'll give you an example here for participatory mapping, which whether it's citizen science or not is kind of like a terminology game, right? So anybody from geography? Yeah, all right, so volunteer geographic information. It is like the sister space to citizen science, apparently. And a lot of the VGI kinds of projects that are going on out there that are volunteer-driven can be more or less science-driven. So OpenStreetMap, it is a popular base layer for mapping if you don't want to be stuck with some of the intellectual property kind of constraints that other sources might give you. And that is completely built by volunteers who map their local environments. And of course, some of it's biased in its own ways, but that's a fantastic resource. See-Click-Fix. It is the sort of like 311 for municipal management, right? But it is not science-driven. It's really like, let's not have our roads fall apart driven, right? Tell you, pothole season in Omaha is tricky. So there are initiatives, though, that can support both the management kinds of priorities and the science priorities. And so some of the participatory mapping really does move in the science direction and can directly support it or indirectly. So one of the little under-the-radar projects that I find utterly delightful is called Casey Trees. It's in Washington, D.C., and it's committed to restoring, enhancing, and protecting the tree canopy of the nation's capital. The DC area is surprisingly well-treed. I lived there for a few years and I was kind of impressed by how much green space there is in relatively urban areas, but like not all urban areas. So part of what they're doing is figuring out where the trees are and who's benefiting from those assets. So if they were going to move toward a community-driven climate resilience, one way that this project could leverage what they're already doing is mapping that canopy alongside public health indicators to advocate for investing more resources in green spaces where it's underdeveloped. This would be a pretty easy equity argument because there are very clear lines being drawn in terms of who is benefiting from that canopy and who's not. So just a quick look at their website. They have their own flavor of citizen science, and most of what they're doing is park inventories in the orange text at the bottom of the first paragraph. They teach you everything you need to do. They do it, seasonally. It's an ongoing effort. And this is the kind of thing that they pull out. You could zoom more into this map, but it's kind of showing you, the reason I chose this view was because it shows you the wards for DC. So they have inventoried almost 22,000 trees at the point in time when I took this snapshot, which was a few months ago. And they have some species distribution data, which is kind of cool. You can see that there is some issue with the mix that they've got, because that big chunk of yellow down there, that doesn't look like the best choice for resilience. Maybe it's cherry trees, who knows. But more importantly, that bottom left pane, canopy coverage by ward. There's an enormous difference between Ward 6 and Ward 3. I could guess where these wards are without seeing numbers on the map. Ward 3 is going to be the wealthier, slightly further out kind of neighborhoods that are really lovely. And Ward 6 is going to be the most urban kind of corridor area with a lot of the lower income households. So this is a fantastic kind of resource. If we were mapping community assets for climate resilience, this would be one of the assets that I would hope would end up on the map. because the data they've got is fantastic. They've got ongoing volunteers, they've got an infrastructure to do stuff, and that's nothing to be sneezed at. But if we really wanted to move it towards climate resilience, there's a couple of things we could do with this data and alongside this project. We could combine this with demographic and other geographic data. I'm sure people have done that at some point. It's not a novel analysis by any means, but not all analyses need to be novel to be meaningful. We could do some spatial analyses to look at how those trees are supporting public health, incidence of asthma, things like that. And importantly, we could do some community workshops to dig into that data, to interpret the results from a local perspective, and to write up talking points that residents could use when they talk to their representation, right? When they talk to the municipal authorities. Those are things that, like, anybody in this room would be a wonderful ally for. And this is not to say that helping a community dig into data and interpret results is easy. It is not. The folks of Alarm in Pennsylvania, which is supported by citsci.org, they do water quality monitoring, and they have for many years done these kinds of trainings for participants to learn to analyze the data, and it is hard. It really is hard. People don't necessarily come well prepared, but you're never going to get a more engaged group of people looking at a set of data as the people whose like neighborhood it reflects on, and you're never going to get a more accurate interpretation of what that actually might mean for people than the ones who live in the community that's affected. And so they may need a hand with some of the analysis, they may need a hand with some of kind of the ecosystem science part of it, but they can actually be really strong assets as well in kind of working through this. We can work with partner organizations to advance joint interests. This is also a very common recommendation among all of the climate resilience resources that I read, is basically don't work in isolation. We've got plenty of isolated efforts already, and we have plenty of efforts out there already. So like, let's do some impact magnification and work together and leverage joint resources and interests. It could maintain and build on this canopy monitoring with other indicators of interest. So every time they go out for the canopy monitoring, they could also be looking for example, insect pests on those trees, right? And check whether they are, have ash borer signs, whether they have Dutch elm disease issues. Actually, they probably don't even have elms there at this point. It's not my specialty, but they probably don't have much of that out there, right? So there's other things that are connected to this kind of work that's already being done that would be minor add-ons for major benefit in the bigger picture, because building up a whole separate monitoring project to get those additional data is kind of a ridiculous use of our time and effort if we can expand the work that's already being done in a meaningful way. It is not quick and easy to stand up a new community-driven project, right? And an existing project can be kind of reimagined in a more community-driven way if we feel like it's too much scientist-driven as well. So that's also an option that we could think about. And some of these could make really good service learning projects. So I don't know how much y'all do service learning stuff here, but it is like the pride and joy of my campus. And we have amazing resources on it. So I'm gonna touch on it again in a little bit. I gotta come back to the community has to come first, right? So as scientists, as researchers, like, we have our interests, we are gung-ho and fired up to learn about these things, but it honestly doesn't matter what we care about if that's not what a community cares about, because it's not gonna help them, right? And so there's a fair bit of like putting our own egos aside and going, okay, what can I learn from you? What can we learn together, right? And so we need to really play a supporting role for some of these vulnerable communities. They don't necessarily have the same resources to bring to it. Anytime we can be that resource, I think that's a wonderful role to play. We can help create metrics and indicators of local resiliency that are realistic for communities to monitor. If we have a good conversation, we can figure out what matters to you and what is reasonable for you to help us understand, right, together. We can also help identify some of the root causes of vulnerabilities. The causal mechanisms might not be clear, right? And the science has told us some of the options, so then we could do some elimination, figure out what's actually going on there, right? We can also look at mechanisms that help us achieve the resilience goals. Well, we know that doing certain kinds of rehab projects have enormous social and environmental benefits. So, like, how about that dead mall down the road? We could do an amazing urban park with that. which was, in fact, the idea that I pitched when they talked about doing this in Omaha. And I don't think that's what they're actually doing there. And of course, a real challenge for a lot of the people in the room is that most community-driven science is not novel. And it's not going to be novel. It is not like an innovation to speak of, but it's still needed, and it's still appreciated, and it's still valuable, right? Environmental quality monitoring has been going on forever. It has been valued by many parties forever. It's not necessarily the most novel thing to get into, but we definitely need more attention to it in a wider range of places. Biodiversity monitoring, we've got lots of great one and done things, but we don't have the depth of knowledge that we need. We don't have the ongoing sustained engagement in monitoring those particular communities either, right? And so that's something that we could do a lot more with to accomplish a lot more from it. We also have resource mapping, so that's something that we don't usually think of as being part of the citizen science space, but I think it's absolutely critical from a climate resilience perspective. And then restoration and rehab projects in urban systems especially, like there's huge value in that, but it needs to be done with the community to really deliver the value for a community. And there's some really lovely kind of examples of how that has worked out that are really easy to find with a quick Google search. So there's a particular case in Minnesota where it was exactly that kind of brownfield from an old mall. They put in stormwater retention and green space, and this was exactly what the community wanted, and it delivered so much more value. So then the question is, what's it take to do any of this, to really get it going? And I'm gonna dramatically oversimplify here to just a couple of talking points, because it's way more complicated than what I'm gonna say here. But we have to get a little more awareness across multiple kinds of perspectives. We need to remove barriers for people to really engage in the work. We need to create incentives. It's not enough to take barriers out of the way. We gotta make it worthwhile. And we also need 1,000 flowers blooming. So 10 years ago, I would have gone on a rant about how inefficient it is for us to be recreating all of these different projects in different places. But this is exactly the kind of thing where we need different projects in different places that are gonna achieve what that local community, what that local environment actually needs and will benefit from. So we do actually need to try that 1,000 flowers blooming to find out what's gonna actually work. So in terms of increasing awareness, what do people actually need to get involved in participatory science? They need to know it works, that it's not wasting their time, that it's been designed for them and with them. And this is if you want the vulnerable communities to engage, right? Some people will do it just because it sounds like fun, interesting, I like being outdoors. That's all great, but if you want to get the people who aren't the usual suspects involved, they need to be part of the conversation for what it even is. It needs to be relevant to their needs, and they need to know that they're not the only one in their community who cares, because these are daunting problems if you think you're alone. And that's where having a community involved is critical. They also need to know that those results are going to be put to use. So I am a huge fan of arrangements where you have some agreements in advance with a municipal authority or some kind of party who will agree to use your results in an appropriate manner. I don't think I've really heard of many cases of that happening, but I think it's got a great deal of potential, because then you've really got honey to attract those bees, right? So how do we achieve that? It's a whole lifetime of work, to be honest, but working with community-based organizations is hands down the way to go. This is repeated in everything, everywhere about working with vulnerable communities, and it is repeated in everything, everywhere about community-driven anything. So in most cases, there's already some capacity. There's already some organization. We need to cooperate and participate with each other and build those collaborations to really get the full value out of it. So if we want to remove some barriers for our communities to participate, we have to really prioritize what they want. Do our homework before you even get involved. Figure out what's affecting these communities. Go through your newspapers. Figure out, before you even start talking to people, what you might want to start talking with them about. Then work with those community-based organizations, involve the community leaders, and focus on their concerns. Right? So maybe my main interest has to take the back seat for a while. It'll get a little bit of love later, but for the most part, I want to work with this community on addressing what they care about, because that's going to be really rewarding for everybody. We have to take the cost away from it. If you want a vulnerable community to participate, they can't buy equipment. And if they have to travel more than like a pittance, we need to reimburse it. Like, that's a real cost for people. If you really want the underrepresented folks to be involved, childcare, right? And that can be community driven too. So there's multiple ways to achieve some of these things, but if you really want to get some of the folks out who are not the usual suspects, this is a surprisingly simple solution. We also have to build trust. So a lot of vulnerable communities don't trust big science, because we're big science, believe it or not. And they have a right to be mistrusting. Things have not gone well for them in the past in interactions with scientists. The Union of Concerned Scientists has a really good guide to how you can build trust with those communities. Another really interesting tip that I saw was creating participation agreements to address some of the issues that would impact participation as you're getting started. So power imbalances or diversity and equity issues. If you have agreements up front about how you're going to handle that and some ground rules for it, your odds of succeeding in actually achieving those goals go up. Amazing, right? And then you have to follow through. You can't just be like, I got the data, see ya, bye, right? That does not go over well. That contributes to the problem, right? So you got to share results and in language that people understand. Providing equal access to resources is harder than it sounds, but people need to have access to their own data. That's really empowering. That's giving over the keys to the kingdom, right? And facilitating their use. So you got people who want to work with this data, but maybe don't know the first thing about where to start with it. And any pointers, even just documentation of the data, goes a really long way. I can't even tell you how many times I've had students go looking for interesting data from, I hate to say it, federal agencies, and find that data from NASA is unusable because it's not documented in understandable language, right? And I have seen this across the gamut, right? So facilitating use of data is actually a really small thing that can go a really long way, because it also shows intent. It shows that you mean to be inclusive and that you want people to have opportunity to engage in a way that they maybe haven't before. If we want to remove barriers for scientists, they need training. Like, we're not trained for this, and this is actually what got me into citizen science in the first place, is I had been a volunteer coordinator in a prior life, and then I was like, these are scientists who are doing volunteer coordination? Like, what even? That's a whole job, that's a whole career, right? Nobody's being trained for that. We need science communication skills. Not everybody is going to be good at that, and that's okay, but we need to up the skills for those who can. We need training in community engagement and co-design processes. I think the shortest avenue there that's easiest to integrate into a curriculum is a course in participatory action research. And that is a pretty well-established set of methods that really goes along with most of these kind of points really well. We also need matchmaking. So we need facilitation in these partnerships. If we're going to work with community-based organizations, like, I don't want to blunder into the Latino community in South Omaha and like trip over myself and fall on my face and make an embarrassment of the whole thing and burn my bridges. Like, no, that's not a good route. The Thriving Earth Exchange from the American Geophysical Union is a really nice example of this, where they work with communities to identify the needs that they have in the face of climate change. It's very, actually, exactly that. And then they recruit scientists to help them to address those issues, right? At UNO, we have the Service Learning Academy, which has multiple models of working with community partners in the university and courses, and it doesn't always get what we want out of it, but the thing that we've got in this model is we have stable staff that are university funded that provide matchmaking. So I go to my friend Julie and say, I'm doing this data analysis course, we need data, who in our community could we work with for the students to, conduct some analyses? Well, this year they turned out Heartland Family Services. So we learned a little bit about how mental health services are being provided to the less fortunate folks in our community, and that's fantastic. They've worked with ecology data in the past. It's a little bit of a train wreck because they know nothing about ecology, right? But if I was in ecology proper, right, I could go to them and say, what are some community organizations we could work with on water quality issues, on, you name it, right? And they would help us find somebody. And they help maintain those relationships. So I don't walk in and blunder. I've got a nice introduction. We've got ground rules. We have support. They help out with logistics like meeting space, and that is so valuable. And then, like I said, logistical support, right? So project management for coordination sounds really trivial, but it makes a huge difference in removing a barrier for the researchers. If this is just one more thing you're doing on top of everything else for like your degree, for promotion, whatever, then it might not make the cut, right? But if you have the service learning grad student who helps set up the meetings and the check-ins and distributes various things and takes care of some of those details for you, which we can actually have through our Service Learning Academy, it makes a huge difference in the feasibility, right? Even space for meetings makes a big difference. And we don't always have easy access to that, and community members don't always have easy access to that. Sometimes we have to get creative. So those are some of just a handful of barriers. That's the tip of the iceberg, but these are some really big ones that if we could get some of those out of the way, it would make a difference. Now, we also need to incentivize people, so getting to know folks before you start asking them to do stuff is just good manners, right? And sharing some project goals that you've come up with together to provide multiple benefits to multiple parties is really kind of the holy grail there, right? If you're working with a disadvantaged community, pay them if you can, right? This is not the traditional model for citizen science, but in developing countries, it is much more so because livelihoods matter. And so this requires work from economically insecure people. If it comes down to participating in your project, spend half a day on training and data collection or whatever, or going to their second job so they can feed their kids, which one do you think they're gonna do, right? So if we can pay people even a little bit, it shows that we're valuing their time, and it makes it easier for them to decide to be involved. Anything that's extended duration or more intensive, that's also an appropriate case for actually paying people. And then make it really easy to share. This has been a shockingly basic stumbling block to getting people to adopt some of the projects that we have worked on in the past, is like we just couldn't turn out here's a visualization of the data that kids can take home to their families to brag on all of the biodiversity that they found in their cubic foot of space, right? And that actually was a deal breaker, because when the teachers couldn't give the kids something they could take home to their families, it just undermined the whole thing. Well, that and like other logistics, but you know, data and visualizations are also shockingly important to people. Like, you would not believe how much people will do for a visualization. They love it, right? And so that also helps them communicate what has been found, what they've been involved in, why it matters. It helps them recruit their neighbors and their community members to be participants as well. So there's a multiplier effect that we can get out of this. We also need to incentivize our scientists, right? We don't get like slow and stodgy for no reason. We need to explicitly remove the risks to professional advancement. That is probably the hardest thing that I can think of in here, because we have to change reappointment, promotion, and tenure to be a little less risk averse, right? We need to actually deliberately train and support activist scholars across sectors. Activism is a dirty word for a lot of scientists, and that is a crying shame. If we decided that as a community we wanted our students to become activist scholars, and we gave them the room to do that, and we made it not an issue that would limit their career options, my God, the stuff we could accomplish, the risks people would take, it would be amazing. This is so much on the minds, especially of PhD students, of like, I can only take so many risks. Which ones do I gamble on, right? We could actually choose to reduce that. We also need meaningful recognitions for applied community research partnerships. Like, this is work. It takes some groundwork, some time to set up those relationships and to really be able to engage in meaningful ways. So if you're gonna go on a long haul with a community, if you're gonna work with an indigenous community where time may operate a little differently in terms of doing research, then that's something that actually needs to be given some attention and some positive feedback, right? And right now we don't have that I'm aware of. That just almost doesn't exist. And I feel super lucky to have landed at a university where they actually value applied research. And so the fact that I publish in Ecology, in a college that's basically a college of computing, like, they're like, yeah, that's great. You're actually doing something that matters in the world. And I'm like, I have found my spot, right? This is my people. And not everybody is so lucky, but we could choose to create institutions that are like that a little more often. So I'll be curious to hear your questions and have further conversations with anyone. Thanks for your attention. Oh my gosh.
I'm about to start looking and chatting with the Hispanic community in Fort Collins about tree canopy. And
Brilliant.
I'm just thinking, okay, at what point do I need an IRB approval for just talking to these people or these kinds of things? Like when do you start that part of the process when you're doing community research?
The second you're asking that question. The sooner you get the A-OK or figure out what the way to move forward is within the confines of what IRB is going to support for you, the sooner you can advocate for doing things in the way that you know is appropriate and is ethical, because IRBs are not actually looking at the ethics, they are looking at liability management. Sorry, I'm a little cynical on that one, but the sooner you start that conversation, the sooner you can move it in the direction you need it to go.
If we could just get questions on the microphone, because we're recording and live streaming this, and they won't hear anything otherwise. I can bring it around to people.
I also love that you asked about IRB. I cannot tell you how often I have been horrified by people skipping that step.
Hello. I don't know. Is that good? Okay. Thanks for your talk. One thing I feel like you mentioned a couple times was sort of the need for scientists to work with other people who like actually are trained in facilitation and communication and things like that. So I guess I'm just wondering like what you think the most important skills are for like scientists to develop, and what are sort of the skills that you would recommend like contracting out, if you will.
Oh, that's a fantastic question. You're putting me in the hot seat here. So I think collaboration skills are probably the most durable and valuable. And those are also kind of like the hardest to get clear instruction on. Most of the time we're learning by trial and error and example, right? And I remember talking with my associate dean for research at my prior job about how we actually need like a boot camp for researchers to learn how to collaborate, because we just aren't being taught this, right? There's actually tons of models for deliberative democracy and for kind of working together in respectful, meaningful ways, right? And most of them translate. So I think fundamental collaboration skills are probably the number one most important. And along with that, the listening skills to like really hear people and validate their experiences, because that is gonna get you so much further in working with a community. I feel like that was a very simple answer to a very complicated question, but you know.
Great talk. Thank you so much. I've learned a ton already. And I love all the synergies I see with other kinds of work I am doing around campus and trying to change the tenure system, et cetera, et cetera. So my question for your talk is, I see like back early on you presented that map from the DC area, I think. And my thought as an ecologist and environmentalist is, oh my gosh, we need to go in there and swoop down on Ward 6 and plant trees. But then, which gets to your, I mean, I guess where's my question here? I think that, as you pointed out, we need ways to have actionable results out of the work. And so like, what are they doing there? And how is that linked to what the community actually might want? Maybe trees are not the right thing for that particular community there, right, for some scientists to go and swoop down and plant.
So the less than stellar answer is, I'm not sure exactly what they're doing in that respect. A lot of these projects have started with these well-meaning scientists wanting to swoop in and take care of a problem, right? And that's the instinct, and that's kind of where we're coming from for a lot of this. And I don't know how much community consultation was part of setting up that project. Now, it's doing some meaningful and useful work, and I think if they wanted to take it to that next level and look at the way to kind of advance the canopy development for some of these communities, really working with those communities and having the conversations would be the next step. Right, so it's it's really hard to know from a distance what's happening in any one space. And so that's where like those conversations that are really local and really community-based really play a huge role in moving it forward. Because yeah, it might not be trees. That might not be actually what they need in that particular spot. It might be just some grassy spaces where kids can play because they are in a concrete jungle. And like a lot of that area is concrete jungle, right? And so just take out some blight and put in some green of any kind, right? That might be exactly what they want. It's just a park or two.
Thanks. That makes me wonder if maybe the inequity in the canopy cover that they're seeing can be used to both know what community you need to be having the conversations with, and who, what are the community organizations who you can connect into that community, and then use it for like fundraising or lobbying with relevant government groups for, look, we need funding to resolve these inequities, and maybe those can kind of come together to make change.
That is exactly the picture I'm trying to paint here. Yeah, I think that's kind of the approach that we need to do a little more often, saying, we see an inequity in the data that we've got right now. Let's have some conversations with the folks collecting the data, with the folks who design the project, and with the folks who live in this area to figure out what kind of action is needed, and what would really benefit people the most.
Thank you for your talk, Dr. Grover. Also, so I want to pick your information science brain a little bit here. And so I agree with all the stuff you said about the community-based, like inquiry and really understanding the community first. And then I also spend a lot of time thinking about, okay, and I'm working in a community that might not have very many resources. They have certain technological needs or things. How do we further develop communities like OpenStreetMap, but in the citizen science space, that can be a group of with CITSI, we're thinking a lot about distributed development, right? And there's a lot of amazing volunteers who want to contribute. So how do we effectively build like intersectional networking with, we've got the local knowledge, and now we have the technical knowledge, which may or may not always be local. Maybe there's some distributed pieces there. How do we partner with them well and really build that relationship across geography?
That is $1 million question, Sarah.
If you can answer for me, that would be great.
Yeah. So when we answer that one, that somebody should write us a check. But like realistically, not all communities are equipped to contribute in the same ways, right? And you already have a pretty clear sense of that. Even so, like if you want to go to the people who will volunteer to help with your tech development, right? That is not also going to be the most diverse community. It probably is a pretty scattered community. So they're going to bring different kinds of expertise and understanding to it. And that's probably fine from the infrastructure level. It's to what degree can some of those local groups adapt the tools that are available to them to really suit their needs. And I think, like, I'm a huge fan of citsci.org because, like, you've created a platform that's pretty flexible and lets people kind of move things forward for themselves in a lot of meaningful ways, and that covers a lot of the bases of the kind of tech needs that people have. And like, that is an enormous asset in itself. And it's the kind of asset that would often be missed if we start looking at, what are the things we can bring to bear on these problems? Like some of the infrastructures that are out there that are available to us, the protocols that are already tested and successful, might not be the first things that we would find. But that should probably be part of that discovery process of figuring out what the assets are, even if they're not the close to home assets. Sometimes those broader infrastructure elements are just absolutely critical, and they don't have to come from here to be useful here.
Thank you. Appreciate that.
You were talking about paying parents specifically. I think of parents immediately who most likely wouldn't be able to participate in citizen science. Do you see examples of maybe local community pressure, positive pressure on employers to provide like a day off, a paid day off to participate in community things, even if it's community science or even just volunteering at a soup kitchen or humane society?
So the movement to be part of, what did they call it, corporate responsibility? Yeah, that is definitely a whole thing. It is often highly performative, but it can be the wedge that gets things started, and it can be a point from which we can advocate. So one of the other signature things that we've had at UNO for many years pre-pandemic was these service learning days throughout the year where anybody in the university community can show up and be involved in doing some kind of community-focused project, right? And it just made it real easy for people to do some volunteering and to do something meaningful, right? And so that's what the corporate responsibility kind of approach is looking at. I think the real challenge there is most of that focuses on larger organizations that can absorb the slack. And not your small businesses, not your municipal governments. It's not the mid-sized groups where somebody being out for a day could actually be problematic for them. And so there have to be some clever solutions to getting some of those other organizations on board with this kind of approach, because there are like legitimate benefits to those businesses for participating. It builds goodwill, reputation matters. Like it is a good community relationship builder. And so I think there's lots of there's lots of things we could brainstorm that would be potentially valuable, but I think it's, again, one of those things that almost has to be local, right? So if the city of Fort Collins is really bought in on climate action, has some plans to move forward, and one of those things is like, we just need some really coordinated, a lot of people power, few days, can we get a release from city employees? Can we get a release from some of these other businesses? Can we get some kind of support that will let more people mobilize? And like that's the level at which those pitches might actually work, is at the local level. So there are some models out there, but I think we could move a lot farther with that. Great question.
You now to come back tomorrow.
Indeed.
So I'd like to thank our speaker with the plaque that's right
Oh my
side
goodness.
up.
Oh, and it even has my real name on it.
It has your real name on it. Appreciating
Thank
your
you.
talk. Let's thank Andrea Grover. If anybody didn't already get a drink ticket from me or Elizabeth or Anna or whoever else had them, Danny had them, let us know. We have more.
And tomorrow I'll be talking about my actual research.